Welcome to WeeklyRe Viu. The HKSAR government recently saw another major shakeup. The reshuffle came against a backdrop of the first anniversary of the implementation of the national security law. So how has Hong Kong changed, and what else can the government do in the coming 1 year? Joining me to talk more about all of this now is DAB lawmaker Horace, who is also an executive counselor. Horace, thank you for joining us.
Hello.
So let's first talk about the national security law. How would you say the national security law changed Hong Kong in the past year? Has the city returned to peace and stability?
I think we need to look back what happened before the implementation of the national security law. Maybe you can remember that actually there were prevalence of violence across the city. And the so-called slogans of Hong Kong independence, self-determination, and mutual destruction has been very common across the city. And I would say that is an actual threat to the national sovereignty and the safety of the Hong Kong community. And after the introduction of the national security law, certainly we can see that this piece of legislation can keep Hong Kong to a safe society that is very important for us to operate as usual. But certainly we all know that the deep-seated problem have not been resolved. But at least this piece of legislation gives us a stable and safe environment for the government, for the administration to carry out, I would say, reform on all kinds of deep-seated problems in Hong Kong.
Right, so since the implementation of the law, we have seen that more than 100 people have been arrested for suspectedly violating the law. So in your opinion, what more has to be done under the legislation? Or do you think that we're slowly going back to the peace and stability that you talked about?
Certainly, this legislation has established a robust legal mechanism and enforcement mechanism for us to safeguard the national security and the restored stability of the Hong Kong society. But as you can see from this piece of legislation, there are still other provisions in the legislation that need the support of all sectors and all different departments of the government to, I would say, to enforce so that the people would not do anything harmful to the national security, national sovereignty and the security of Hong Kong society. So we still have a lot to do after introduction of this legislation. For example, as you can see that the government has give a very clear guideline about the free censorship from the perspective of national security. I truly believe that the government has a lot to do in other aspects of the legal framework so as to safeguard the national security in Hong Kong.
So you talked about the recent film censorship.
That's right.
What else do you think needs to be done with the legal framework of the law? What aspects or in what part of society should the government enforce the law even more?
Yes, film censorship actually is one example that we have to do reform. As you can see, we have many loopholes in the past legislation because we have the low concept of the national security in many local legislation, and that is the reality. We still have a lot to do, for example, in the education sector. Why? Because you can see from the national security law, it requires the Hong Kong government to do much more in the school about the education on national security. I believe that in addition to enforcement mechanism, where we have to do a lot more on on the education part about the national security, that is much more important because it can prevent what happened harmful to the national sovereignty. I think prevention is much more important than any legal arrest under the legislation.
Right, so aside from the national security law, there have been calls for the current government to implement or just start the process of implementing Article 23 of the Basic Law. So this article has a quite similar legal sense with the national security law. So do you think there's still an urgent need to implement the Article 23?
Yeah, actually, Hong Kong, we have the constitutional obligation to enact Article 23 under the Basic Law for 24 years since 1997. However, we haven't discharged our constitutional obligation with a good reason. And I will say I cannot see any reason why we can further delay to discharge our obligation under the Basic Law. We have to complete our legislation about the national security. And Article 23 enactment is a part and parcel of our constitutional obligation. So I truly believe that, and I urge the government to prepare the groundwork as soon as possible. And as mentioned by the Secretary for Security, that although it may not, he cannot complete the legislation by this year, but we urge the minister to do the groundwork within this year so that the next administration can complete the Article 23 enactment in the next administration.
Right, let's talk about the recent government reshuffle. It happened at a time when the current administration only has a year left. What do you make of the latest changes among top officials? Are there going to be concrete changes, or do you just think that it's just a normal thing to have top officials trying out different posts?
Yeah, and many people will say that in the last year of the administration, they should not do too much work and there's no room for reshuffle. That's not the case in Hong Kong for the time being, because you can see from the last couple of years, we have faced a lot of challenges in Hong Kong, no matter whether it's domestic or international. And this year, I would say, is quite critical time for Hong Kong to lay down a solid foundation for the next administration to carry out reform to tackle the deep-seated problems. So this year is quite important and critical. And I will say reshuffle shows the determination of the government to try to have a strong cabinet to do as much work as possible in the last year of the administration so that it can give a very, very good foundation for the next administration to carry out the reform. So I welcome the reshuffle, and I sincerely wish that the new cabinet can let Hong Kong to maintain as a stable and safe city so that we can carry out the reform.
So critics have always worried that the new appointments will make Hong Kong become a police state, with John Lee now being Chief Secretary and Chris Tang now being Secretary for Security. Do you agree with this comment that Hong Kong is turning into a police state?
I think it's a quite unfair comment because as a minister, certainly it may come from inside or outside the government. It may come from disciplinary or non-disciplinary services. We should consider the candidate in terms of his competency, his determination, whether he is able to maintain a very good legislative and executive relations, and whether he can have a strong executive-led government. So we should look at the personal ability of the candidate rather than his background. We welcome all good candidates from different sectors of the society, and certainly the discipline service is one of the sources for us to have a strong cabinet.
Right. Right, so now that Carrie Lam's government is nearing its end, how would you evaluate this administration in particular? How has the government done in terms of decision making? What more could be done?
I would say this administration, they are facing a very unprecedented and very tough time since 1997, because the administration not only to consider the domestic factors, but it also need to consider international factors, especially in the context of the relations between China and the United States. And I would say that is unprecedented to the Hong Kong government since 1997. So I would say it's quite a tough time for the administration. And I would sincerely hold that and urge the government to focus how to tackle the deep-seated problems after the implementation of the national security law and the election arrangement, so that we can have a stable and safe environment. I believe that the Hong Kong people want to see that the government can resolve the deep-seated problems such as the housing problem, the elderly, and the medical health problem as soon as possible.
Right, so would you say that there are any officials whose performances in the past 4 years are not up to standard? So what more could be done?
It's quite unfair for me to blame the minister without an opportunity for him or her to respond. But certainly, the government still have a lot to do about the land supply, the housing, and the public health reform. That is, I would say that is the problem generally agreed by the people that the government should do as much as possible. And I hope that the government can do much more in the last year of the administration.
Right, that's all the time we have. Thank you, Horace, again for joining us.